Washington, D.C. is dealing with quite a lot right now. A hostile Republican Congress, a crime rate that, while it's come down, is still too high, and a struggling local economy based on the DOGE cuts that the Trump administration has implemented. How can the next mayor fix all of DC's problems and make it a more dynamic, better off city? Kenyan McDuffie is a former city council member in Washington, D.C., and he's one of the major candidates for mayor of D.C. in the upcoming 2026 mayoral race. Kenyan joins the podcast today to talk about his vision for the city, growing up in D.C., implementing the abundance agenda, and how D.C. can solve its problems with the economy, crime, and more. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to drop us a like, a subscribe, recommend us to a friend, all of that is appreciated. But if you really want to support the podcast, you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. You should also check out, on CNL's website, the New Liberal Action Summit, which is taking place July 15th to 17th this year. This will be our 5th annual New Liberal Action Summit. We'll be talking about how to implement the abundance agenda, how to defend liberal values. At a time when democratic principles around America and around the world are facing a pretty dark moment, it's more important than ever to build a coalition of young, center-left leaders, and that's what NLAS is set to do. Registration is open for NLAS, so if you're interested, go to cnliberalism.org/NLAS. We would love to see you there. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Now let's jump into it. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Kenyan McDuffie. Kenyan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeremiah. Look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you here. And I think to start, we should talk a little bit about DC as a city. You are obviously running for mayor of DC. It's a city that needs a lot of fixes in a lot of different ways. You know, some of the problems arguably fall to city governance in the past, but some of the problems are just completely external, completely hard to account for, I think. And we have a lot of listeners in DC, but we also have a lot of listeners nationally and internationally who might not know the various ways in which DC is unique. It's very different governing Washington, DC than it is any other city. So can you give us a little bit of a quick explainer of like, how does DC actually work? And how does that differ from your standard, Chicago, New York, Miami, the normal American city setup?
Great place to start, Jeremiah. DC is one of a kind. It is unique. It does not compete with any other big city in America for the title of nation's capital. It's only one, and it's Washington, D.C. On the other hand, we get compared to other major cities around the country a lot, except we don't have a state to fall back on. In other words, in Washington, D.C., we've got 700,000 residents who do everything like every other U.S. citizen in every of the 50 states, except we don't have a right to vote. We pay more federal taxes per capita than any state in the union. We go off and fight in wars, just like the citizens of every other state in the union. We actually have a larger population than 2 U.S. states, and yet we don't have representation in Congress that has a vote. We do not have 2 United States senators, and we do not have a congressional delegation that has an actual vote. We have one non-voting delegate in Congress, and it really means that our budgets and the laws that we make are subject to congressional approval. Every single thing that the legislative branch of the local DC government, which is the District of Columbia Council, does, goes up to Congress for approval, passes approval. And as has been the case lately, we've had some instances where Congress has decided to overturn local DC law. And it means that our budget is less than what it was previously, both because of some of the decisions that are happening out of the federal government, both the White House, but also some of the congressional action that has cost Washington, D.C. residents literally to the tune of billions of dollars. And it's something that I think a lot of Americans just aren't aware of. We are a big city, unlike any other city in the United States.
And so the sovereignty of the typical city, let's just throw out like Atlanta, Georgia, or Miami or whatever, they will have their own city government. They are subordinate to the state that they live in and then to the federal government. But really, what they have to worry about is their own city charter and their own state's constitution, perhaps. With Washington, it's really just the city council will do things, but Congress itself is, rather than the state constitution of whichever state you're in, Congress itself basically is the governing body, the veto power.
That's correct. Congress, by law, gave the District of Columbia limited home rule back in 1973. The first mayor and council under that Home Rule Act were seated in January of 1975. And ever since, we've had the form of home rule government that we've been operating under for the last more than 50 years. But unlike any other jurisdiction, as you articulated, we are subject to the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, that essentially says Congress shall make all laws with respect to the District of Columbia.
And this is a problem, especially today, I think, because maybe I'm too starry-eyed about the past, but in the past, partisanship wasn't quite the monster that it is now. And, DC gets some home rule in the 70s and the 80s. Things will come up that, make Congress a little bit ornery. But for the most part, I think that DC was kind of left to its own devices. But these days, it just seems like when Republicans are in power, given that DC is a heavily Democratic city, partisanship being what it is, it's worse than ever. I mean, I'm not a resident of DC. You are. You're a longtime resident. You can tell me if I'm wrong here, but do you think this kind of political interference story is getting worse over time?
It is absolutely getting worse over time. We've never seen the levels of federal encroachment on the District of Columbia's home rule, at least in my lifetime. And you're seeing a hyper focus both from the White House and Republicans in Congress in their concerted efforts to overturn our laws.
And it just seems like you're a convenient, target to go after, basically. Like Congress is not very productive right now. What's something we can do? What's somebody we can beat up in the press? Oh, let's go after DC, kind of a thing.
Washington, D.C. Historically has been a political football, but I think we're facing the greatest existential threat to our home rule that we've seen in 50 years of home rule.
Well, so we're going to get into all this. There's one other way that I think DC is very unique and very unlike almost any other city, and that is, I would say, the economy of DC.
Mhm.
And this is going to get into kind of what your campaign is based off of and what you're proposing. But the economy of DC, more so than just about any other place in America, it's really a one-town shop, right? Like, this is a company town.
Yep.
It's the federal government is by far the largest employer in its various departments and
Yep.
categories and organizations. And if it's not the federal government, it's think tanks and lobbying groups and people who do business with the federal government. And
Yes.
I guess, can you explain to people, number one, this is much more concentrated than just about any other city. Number two, how does that impact Washington when something like, the second Trump presidency starts and you have something like DOGE?
Yeah, it's a great question. So DC has essentially been a federal town and viewed externally as the capital of the U.S. and a sort of sleepy government, both federal and local town, right? One employer town. But it is anchored by what is happening in Congress, the White House, Supreme Court. It is anchored by those institutions that so many people love, which are the monuments, the malls, and the museum, right? So it is essentially something that is known, particularly from folks who don't live here, as a federal government town. And it affects our economy in that way. 30 years ago, federal employment represented closer to about a third of our spending and our GDP in the District of Columbia. That has been shrinking ever since. Way back when President Clinton and Al Gore had an initiative to really streamline processes in the federal government, it ended up reducing jobs, but we saw an increase in spending on federal contracting, which buoyed the regional economy, and it also increased business and professional services sector within Washington D.C., which has been something that we've depended on. And as we see over the last year with the current administration, really reducing federal jobs writ large, as well as reducing federal spending, that impact is being felt right here in Washington, D.C., and on our region, quite frankly, to the extent that we are seeing spending pressures in our local budget of $1.1 billion. To take it a step further, DC is tethered enough to the federal government that bond rating agencies actually, hit us so that we lost our AAA bond rating. So we were downgraded because of our proximity and association with the federal government and all the ups and downs of policies that are impacting the country, frankly, and the world when you think about all the things that are going on. But that impact has been particularly acute on Washington, D.C.
Yeah, you see it kind of uh, rebound everywhere in terms of just, the housing market went through a real slump there because so many people got fired all at once. You see it, like you mentioned, tax revenue that when if people are leaving, the city government might all of a sudden have a revenue hole. Small businesses might discover that it's harder for them to stay in business because there's just less people walking around. That it really rebounds in a lot of places, and it strikes me as an outsider that DC would just enormously benefit from some kind of second industry, from some kind of, whether it's tech, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's anything at all, but that diversification would be valuable because you guys can't control what the federal government is going to do or not do. How do you make that happen, though? As someone who's lived there for a long time, as someone who's been in city government, how do you actually build a plan to diversify the economy of the city?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that we're grappling with right now as we think about the impact of federal policy, and frankly, just a hostile federal government on the District of Columbia's local budget and the things that we represent as locally elected officials in expressing the values and the desires of the people who elect us. And when I think about the impact of the federal government and the need to, I think, really rethink our local economy in many ways, it's not that we're going to get away from the federal government as an anchor. In fact, I think some of the things that make the economy very challenging right now are still fundamentally solid aspects of our local economy. I mentioned earlier the mall, the monuments, the museums. There's only one place that you can go in this country to really get what DC offers in that respect. And so The fundamentals there are solid. So, how do we build on the tourism, hospitality, restaurant, nightlife, arts, entertainment, sports industries that in many ways make the District of Columbia unique? I think we have solid fundamentals to our economy. We have a horrible branding problem right now that we need to work on and tell a different story and give a different experience for people who want to come to Washington, D.C. That means tourism domestically from the 50 states, but it also means a focus on international tourism to try to attract some of those international tourists back to Washington, D.C. Why? Because when they come, they actually stay longer and they spend more, right? But then it's also, looking at ways to pivot slightly from being viewed as the federal government town that employs a lot of federal workers and what that means for federally adjacent opportunities, right? You mentioned technology, and I think that's a real thing for us. We have to lean all the way in to innovation in a way that we haven't before so that it translates into real jobs and the opportunity for us to grow our economy. You think about investing in clusters around AI, cyber. You think about climate tech. You think about some of the things associated with some of the defense spending and other gov tech related areas that the District of Columbia can lean into and frankly benefit from, given our proximity to the federal government and the District of Columbia being a place where employers would likely want to be. Why, Jeremiah? Because we are, and need to tell this story, the talent capital of America. We have a highly educated population, and despite the federal workers being laid off or taking the fork in the road, the reality is they're still here. And our efforts need to work and focus on retaining that talent in the District of Columbia and putting them in places where they can get opportunities in those areas that we discussed, whether it is some of the anchors that have really buoyed the District of Columbia's resurgence over the years, including the tourism, hospitality, restaurant, nightlife, arts, entertainment. Sports, we're spending a lot of money on sports right now, and it's smart to do so because the nearly $4 billion that we're going to spend to bring the Commanders back and build a stadium is going to be matched in the commercial development on that 180-acre RFK site, such that it's going to attract billions of dollars of other capital that's going to be invested to do those hotels, the restaurants, and other neighborhood serving amenities. Where do people fit into that ecosystem in terms of new opportunities? Both young folks who we need to train to get employment, but also those displaced federal workers who are very smart, skilled, educated, but need to be connected to different opportunities in the District of Columbia's economy.
There was something you mentioned in there that was really interesting to me because it actually I feel like it's such a emblematic thing where you talked about the branding, which is suffering in some sense. And there's some things, that you just can't control. The international tourism aspect, for instance, like international tourism to America just overall is down because America's reputation is kind of in the toilet because of who Donald Trump is and the actions that he takes. And you, as a potential future mayor, you can't stop that from happening. You do what you can, but you can't stop Donald Trump from ruining our reputation. You have to ride out that storm. But there are other ways where you can impact your city's branding. And one thing that I know, when I talk to friends from around the country, if you ask them about DC, beyond just museums, the seat of the federal government, one thing that they have is potentially a negative perception around crime. And this is something that a lot of cities have struggled with post-pandemic. Everybody saw crime rates spike around 2020, 2021, and has, kind of been struggling to bring them back under control since then. What's your view on kind of, I guess, the current state of things? Has progress been made in DC with bringing down crime? Do you think there's more to do? And specifically, what actions should the city government be taking that it's not taking right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the good news is that crime in the District of Columbia is down. In fact, it's down to levels that we haven't seen in a couple of decades, right? And so that's part of the story that we need to make sure is getting out there, in contrast with some of the things that have been emanating out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue about DC being crime ridden. The reality,
I mean, I think just to be fair, I mean, I think there's been a lot of good progress made since
oh,
2021,
oh,
right?
absolutely,
But
yeah,
but I think you would agree it's still too high compared to some comparable cities, right?
yeah, no. So some of the things that we have been doing in the District of Columbia to help drive crime down is to focus on continuing to be a city that looks at policing as a process that builds trust between law enforcement and communities, and making sure that we support our officers with the resources and technology they need to do their jobs well. But also looking at community violence intervention in a way that really prioritize treating crime as a public health epidemic, and getting into communities with resources that address the challenges that individuals have seen, frankly, in communities that have been plagued by crime for decades, right? Making sure that they understand that if we can intervene before crime has happened, identify people most likely to commit a crime, connect them with workforce development training and a job opportunity, then that person is less likely to be the person who is engaging in crime in the District of Columbia. So for DC, what we're seeing that has worked is a both and approach where we are supporting our well trained, culturally competent law enforcement officers to do their jobs well with a focus on community oriented policing, so that they're showing up in neighborhoods.
And this is a phrase that can be tossed out there, but can you explain what you mean by that when you say like community orienting policing?
Sure.
Because I mean it could be something that just passes people by, but I think it's
Yeah.
worth diving into that. Like, what specifically do you think is community oriented policing, and how does it differ from another model that you would not be
Sure.
as favorable to?
I would contrast community oriented policing with a sort of tough on crime model. And just by way of background for folks, I'm a former prosecutor right across the board in Prince George's County, and a former civil rights attorney in the United States Department of Justice in the special litigation section, where part of what I did was investigate police departments around the country, offer technical assistance to help improve them in their policing models.
That's an interesting background because you've prosecuted criminals, but you've also gone after civil rights violations. Like, how many people have both sides of that? I
Yeah.
guess.
And I also grew up in the District of Columbia during the 80s and 90s when we were experiencing the crack epidemic, and we were the murder capital of the United States. So I also bring that lived experience as a perspective that complements the professional experience that I've gained in my career. Now, community oriented policing is a model that ensures that law enforcement has the resources, tools, technology that it needs to do quality policing, but it also understands that great policing is built on trust. The ability to close cases after a crime happens depends on law enforcement's ability to interact with the communities within which they police. And I think the best models of community policing prioritize ways that officers can integrate into communities and institutions, schools, around schools, not necessarily inside, but around schools, around community centers, playgrounds, rec centers, really being of the community. It's better when a police officer actually lives in the community within which they police, right? Because if they live there, they've got family, they worship there, they send their kids to the schools, then that investment as an officer, I think, is better reflected in the comprehensive way that they approach their work, right? They show up during the good times and not just in response to 911. Community oriented policing places value on building relationships across communities, so that those individuals and institutions that are police actually help, support the efforts of the Metropolitan Police Department to investigate cases, gain evidence, and ultimately close cases working with prosecutors. So that's a very important approach to policing, and it's one that the District of Columbia has gotten a lot better in over the years. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we weren't, the late 90s, as good as we were today in our approaches to community policing. We also didn't have the efforts that I've helped to really champion and author legislation that have ushered in a public health based approach to crime prevention and intervention, not to displace policing, but to support and augment the approach to fighting crime and, in many instances, attempting to prevent it even before it happens.
Yeah. I think there's two things that people think about when they think about like crime is too high. I'm upset about crime. This is a very reasonable thing for voters to be upset about. And the first thing is the obvious stuff. If the murder rate is too high, if you are the murder capital of the world, or if you have more serious crime, more gun crime, carjackings, serious robberies, more than other cities, people are going to be upset about that. But there's also kind of this like just generalized public disorder, kind of chaos where you see the kind of stuff where people are stealing from drugstores and setting up outside and just selling uh, liquid detergent on the street that they've taken from the store one block away. It's the reason why it seems like such a minor thing for people to care about, but it's a real quality of life issue when you go into CVS and everything is behind behind a glass wall that you have, and it speaks like there's no public trust, there's no public order, and it feels like the city's breaking down. And I don't know if maybe I'm building this model of like there's kind of two different ways to think about this, but like how do you address the second part where just it feels like there's this generalized decay? And like I deal with this in New York too, where just post pandemic, it felt like certain parts of the social contract were breaking down. And I don't think this was a DC specific problem. I think this happened in San Francisco and New York and a lot of big cities. But even if it wasn't caused by, city government policies, it's still something the city government has to tackle, right? So
Yeah.
how would you be dealing with this in a McDuffie administration?
Yeah, I think you deal with it in two ways: accountability and opportunity. Right? You have to hold people accountable when they commit crimes. Obviously, when they commit violent crimes, but you also have to hold them accountable across the board when they commit crimes. It's very important that you do that, and you do that with consequences that happen swiftly and certainly.
This is a favorite of this podcast, by the way. A recent episode we did with a researcher named Jennifer Doliak. She loves to talk about it's not how long the sentence is, it's how certain it is that you will be caught, right?
Yeah.
It's long sentences don't necessarily help, but you just have to be certain that you won't get away with whatever action you're taking.
You want the consequences to happen swiftly and certainly. And you want them to be appropriate consequences, but you want there to be consequences. And everybody needs to understand that aspect of the social contract. On the other hand, you also need to usher in opportunity into the communities that have been plagued by violence. I think for years, that tough on crime model just focused on enforcement and didn't focus on opportunity. I think you need to do both. Washington, D.C. is a world class city. And I've spent my entire life here, both growing up doing some of the worst violence that we've seen in our city's history, but also work professionally around the country at DOJ and across the board in Prince George's County and understand what it takes to really fight crime and deliver justice for victims. You have to have the accountability be swift and certain, but you also have the opportunity flow into those communities because it's not thousands of young people across the District of Columbia committing crimes. It's not thousands of adults, right? It is people who come from communities that are lacking in resources, lacking in opportunity, and I think using government's tools in a way that doesn't make excuses, but that shows up differently, right? So that they understand for them what the pathway looks like to economic opportunity and security in today's Washington, D.C. For years, we built up a lot of buildings downtown, Jeremiah, and elected officials took pride in counting cranes. And at a time where there aren't so many cranes going up and we need to figure out how to diversify our economy and create jobs, we also have to have that conversation in communities that have the greatest needs for employment. And those communities are largely communities of color that have been marginalized for the District of Columbia for a really long time. So it's a both and accountability and opportunity. And I have a unique combination of experience, life experience and professional experience to really deliver that for Washington, D.C.
There was something that made the news recently, and I'm curious how you think this intersects with the idea that, like, swift and certain consequences, and that is the issue of speed cameras going up in certain neighborhoods. And you had some comments on it that kind of set off some fireworks in local media about whether or not speed cameras are a good idea. I live in New York. I don't even own a car, so I'm all in favor of speed cameras, punish the drivers, etc.
Yeah.
But do you think? I mean, do you want to talk about
Yeah.
why you think what you're saying about speed cameras, and do you think that some of the reaction to that was justified or a little overblown? You want to talk? I mean,
Yeah.
because
No, I love
it
to.
intersects with this idea of, like, if you're doing something wrong, punishment should be swift and certain, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I love to talk about it because I think perhaps there's some folks who understood my position and supported it. And then there are perhaps some folks who I think, were quick to react and didn't have a full understanding of what I meant when I said what I said. So essentially, what I said was that speed cameras need to be about safety, right? That is what we're prioritizing. We just talked about crime. Another aspect of safety is safety on our streets, right? Safety when it comes to transportation. We are a world-class city, and we need to have world-class transportation options, including pedestrians who walk, whether you are on a bike traveling or whether you're in a car. We want more people to actually take public transportation, but we want to ensure that everybody who uses our streets in Washington, D.C. are safe when they do so, which means street cameras are good when they are placed up for safety. But when they become predatory, when they become devices that cities use to generate revenue on the backs of low income communities, then it's a problem. And it should be a problem for everybody, right? And if you are really about safe streets for everybody who uses them, then I think you would agree with me that there should be cameras up, traffic cameras up in every area of Washington, D.C. that prioritize enhancing safety. If that's not the reason why they're there, then they need to be removed.
Well, how do you tell the difference between those two? I guess, like, if anywhere where somebody's speeding 25 miles over the limit seems pretty unsafe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about it. And using data in a way that is very transparent, not that requires a person who has an interest or has questions to have to use a Freedom of Information Act request, but something that's on a publicly available dashboard that indicates where some of the areas in our city that are least safe. And that should be the metric that we're using to determine where those cameras should go. And so I think it's important for everybody to understand my position on this and how I think the District of Columbia should prioritize the use of traffic cameras. Prioritize safety for everybody who uses our streets: pedestrians, cyclists, people in cars, folks who are taking public transportation. Everybody who traverses Washington, D.C. In a multimodal way should feel safe and be safe, actually, in Washington, D.C. And the speed cameras are a part of that. They just can't be abused or used solely for generating revenue.
Well, look, I grew up in kind of suburban Georgia, and there were certain towns that you knew if you drove through those towns, the entire city government was based around catching people who went on the highway from point A to point B. You have to drive through this town, and they'll get you if you are 3 miles over, and that's the entire city government funding model. So
Yeah.
I appreciate I appreciate the general concept. I am also just the kind of person who is more than happy to crack down on car violence. With way too many people die in car crashes, so
There are way too many crashes on District of Columbia. We need to do a better job of achieving Vision Zero's mandates in Washington, D.C. And I 100% agree with you. And it's important for me to stress that. I've seen some horrific crashes in the District of Columbia at some really horrible intersections. I've seen literally a young girl's body lay on the ground after being struck by a van while she was riding her bicycle with her dad, right? Nobody in life should have to experience that. And the District of Columbia, and every city for that matter, should do everything humanly possible to prevent those types of crashes, right? And the District of Columbia can do more and should do more and must to ensure that everybody feels safe to eliminate those types of crashes in our city. But I also think that our government needs to work for everyone, right? In all 8 of our wards, across incomes, across backgrounds, and we shouldn't just be good at traffic enforcement, right? Whether it's a speed camera or a parking ticket. I think most people would not argue that the District of Columbia is pretty good at both of those things, but how good are we in making sure that people can get a permit to renovate their homes or build hundreds of units of affordable housing that we need in the District of Columbia? We need to do a lot better when it comes to those things.
Well, look, if you're talking about building more homes, then you're in the right place.
Yeah.
And that leads me to maybe the next thing we should talk about, which is we've been talking about the general ideas here. How do we make a more diverse economy? How do we make sure people have access to jobs? How do we make sure they feel safe on DC streets? But you have a plan for these kind of things, and your opponent also claims to have a plan. Not to be a prognosticator, but this kind of looks like a two-person race, and your opponent is further to the left than you, and she would proclaim. I think she would say that she's more pure, perhaps. She's more of the DSA, incredibly progressive wing of the party. How she has the preferred framing of how she'd like to contrast between the two of you. How would you describe this race in terms of competing visions for what DC should look like, what the city government should be doing? Because everybody's going to have a plan, right? It's just how do you propose to get there, and why do you think that's a better path than what your opponents are offering?
Sure. My vision for the District of Columbia is to make this city more affordable, to make it more opportunity rich, particularly in communities that have lacked opportunity historically in Washington, D.C., and to deliver a government that is accountable to all of its residents, regardless of where they live or who they know, around transparency, performance, and making sure that everybody feels represented and reflected in the future prosperity of the District of Columbia. So, affordability, opportunity, and accountability. When it comes to housing, I do differ from my principal opponent in a way that I'm looking to lower the cost and not, make lofty promises about policies that have not been tested and are likely going to cost taxpayers in the form of increased taxes. You think about programs designed to try to address affordability, and the District of Columbia has come a long way. Childcare, for example, we have universal pre-K, right? Which means your kid can go to and get a quality education beginning at 3 years old, right? So 3 and 4 year old pre-K. We also have programs designed to help defray the costs that childcare workers are paid through pay equity. We have, childcare subsidies that are in place, as well as a program called P-Keep, which has expanded pre-K in other areas. So we do a lot, but we need to prioritize that in our budgeting so that those programs are fully funded and work well for everybody to help reduce the cost of childcare. But promises of free childcare, right, means additional spending at a time when the District of Columbia simply doesn't have it. And what it means is that my principal opponent is likely going to raise taxes on hardworking District of Columbia residents and working families. And that's not fair. It's not just. And it's not the way that we ought to grow our economy with guardrails, right? Grow our economy at its base in a way that attracts new residents and new businesses to the District of Columbia. When it comes to housing specifically, we lower costs by protecting the housing that we have across incomes, but particularly deeply affordable housing. We need to unlock any stuck deals that are shovel ready and create a fast lane for them to get their proper permitting so that they can put the shovel in the ground and build the housing that we need, right? That's the way that you address some of these issues. We have other issues in government right now when it comes to housing that don't require new laws. For example, we have inclusionary zoning policies in the District of Columbia that are some of the most progressive in the country, but we have a lot of units of inclusionary zoning that sit vacant today because of the cumbersome process at the Department of Housing and Consumer Development in the District of Columbia that need to be eliminated. We have to eliminate the red tape when it comes to permitting as it is associated with housing and starting and growing a business. We need to replace that red tape with green tape and really create fast lanes for us to be able to have the economic activity that we need to grow our economy at its base
Hmm.
and not just resort as a default to raising people's taxes. I do not support that. And that's a clear contrast between myself and my opponent.
I want to make an analogy here to like national politics, and we'll come back to DC, but there's a thing that's happening recently that just it baffles me a little bit as a Democrat, where there's an increasing number of Democratic senators and Congress people who are saying things like, I've got a new tax plan. Nobody under $70,000 should have to pay income tax. And then somebody else will come out with, well, I don't think any family making under $100,000 should pay income tax. And it's like the Democratic Party first is just falling into this idea that you can just tax billionaires and that's the only source of revenue that you'd ever need. But it's like they're backing down from the idea that we should all contribute into shared prosperity.
Mhm.
But I think the root of this is that, look, there's an affordability crisis in cities around the country. The cost of housing, the cost of childcare, the cost of energy, the cost of a lot of things is very high. Housing, especially in so many cities, has just skyrocketed. And rather than do anything to actually make the housing more affordable at its root, increase supply of housing or cut red tape, they just come up with these solutions that are just like, well, what if we just give everyone another voucher? What if we give them a stimulus check? What if we just cut taxes? It's almost like the slop form of affordability that doesn't do anything to actually address the root cause of why it's so expensive in the first place, right?
Yep. Yep. We have to have more of an abundance strategy in Washington, D.C. when it comes to housing. And frankly, when it comes to childcare, we need to look at the policies that are in place, the red tape, the regulations that make it more difficult for people to build and eliminate those policies, prioritizing safety of residents and the quality of the housing, right? But we need to focus on economic growth with guardrails that protect people from being displaced. So having anti-displacement mechanisms woven into the fabric of how we govern is going to be incredibly important. But when it comes to housing, we have to build. We have to eliminate those regulations, but also modernize zoning in a way that increases supply. Right? I think most people understand that's how you address some of the affordability issues that we're faced with on the housing side. But also understanding that when people have to carry costs, builders have to carry costs, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit housing provider, it becomes so expensive that today you have some of those nonprofit housing providers actually selling assets, or at least trying to sell assets. They're even struggling to do that because capital has zero confidence in the District of Columbia's housing market right now because of the challenges that we're facing, including challenges associated with the non-payment of rent by bad actors who have the ability to pay, but just take advantage of how long it takes to evict someone in the District of Columbia, which is unique in our region. We have to factor in all those things, have more of a strategy that is grounded in abundance, and eliminate the things that make it difficult for people to build housing. You think about childcare, well, on the supply side of that as well, we've got 22% vacancy at our downtown office buildings. What does that mean to replace some of those vacant spaces with childcare, right? Reducing the regulatory burdens to be able to establish a childcare facility in a downtown office building. What does it mean to reduce the burden for people to be able to have childcare facilities in their homes, right? What does it look like if we're thinking about the cost associated with getting the credentials to be a childcare provider? All those things, I think, ultimately
Yeah,
contribute
this
to,
is this is something I think about all the time. I
yeah,
mean, I'm just to echo what you're saying, like I'm I didn't grow up that long ago, but I remember when I went to childcare, I'm pretty sure I was being cared for by people who were good and compassionate and wonderful women, and I don't think that they had master's degrees in childcare. I'm not sure that they needed them, but the certification process, it seems like it only goes in one way, that there's just more and more and more required over time. And look, nobody wants like dangerous people watching your kids, but also like we do have to be realistic about that. Like children have survived throughout history with, not having, like, you don't need a college degree to watch a baby.
that's right.
We all survived without our mothers having college degrees necessarily. Neither
That's
one of
right.
my parents had a college degree, and I like to think I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
So, there's
I'm the first man in my family to graduate from college or to get a graduate degree. And Miss Margaret, who I'm actually sitting in a home that my grandparents bought back in 1952. Miss Margaret up the street on Franklin didn't have a college degree or all these certificates or credentials that are now required to provide childcare. She took care of me, my siblings, and so many other people on the block. She loved us. She doted on us, and she made sure we had everything that we needed so that our parents could actually work, right? And really earn an income to be able to take care of themselves and their families. And I think we need to be mindful of all the things that we do in the law that have great intentions, but have horrible collateral consequences for our ability to grow our economy and allow more people to participate in the workforce, earn income, pay taxes that we can use to provide that strong social safety net. But we're never going to address the entire affordability crisis in childcare in the District of Columbia simply on the subsidy side. We have to do more to ease the burden on costs associated with it, and I have a plan as the next mayor to be able to do that.
Yeah, to me, it always seems like, look, subsidies can be useful, but they can't be the permanent solution because you're just in a place where either the childcare or the housing or the healthcare or whatever it is, it still costs an enormous, crazy amount of money. You've just shifted the burden to somebody else is paying, the taxpayer, the ultimately debt sometimes, but like you have to actually solve the core problem. So
That's right.
I love to hear that messaging. I do want to ask, kind of shifting to a question about DC's demographics, which are really, really unique in a way that most cities in America are not. And you grew up in DC, so I'm sure you're more aware of this than I am. But there's a class of like long-term DC residents, natives, locals, however you want to say it, and then there's kind of this very large and influential class of people who move to DC from all around the country. And typically, these are young, idealistic people. They're working for, some think tank or for some department of the government, or maybe they're a Hill staffer. And certainly it's good to have a influx of young people to your city who all have great educations and they want to change the world, and like, who would turn that down, right? But it does create this almost like uh, two different kinds of Washington DCs. How do you think about that as mayor? Do you think that's just, well, it's kind of how the city's always going to be? There's going to be this one group and this other group. Do you think it's a problem, or is it just a feature and not necessarily a problem? Is there something you would do to make the city more integrated? Just how do you wrap your mind around this as somebody who's been around the city your whole life?
Born and raised, fourth generation, Washington, D.C. Again, as I just mentioned, this house has been in my family since 1952, and we love everything about this community. But this community today in Stronghold, where I live, looks a lot different for my kids than it did for me. But it's the same for my parents, right? Who were baby boomers. I say all that to say that DC is always going to have an aspect that makes it a really, a town where people come and go, right? Being the seat of the federal government means that people are going to come here for jobs and opportunity. And perhaps when a certain administration leaves, they'll leave with it. I don't think that's something that you ever replace. And it's probably been the case for Washington, D.C. since its inception, right? But a lot of the folks who come here to live do integrate well into our city. One of the best things about DC, I think one of the strongest assets about Washington, DC, is its beautiful diversity. And I'm going to do everything in my power to preserve that, which means pushing back on policies that, affect our immigrant neighbors to the point where they're being snatched away from their families and don't feel safe leaving their homes to go to work or to go to school, right? We need to push back against those policies and really prioritize fairness and justice. On the other hand, the beautiful diversity that is DC is something that should be celebrated. Everybody who lives here won't be a native, right? But in many cases, the people who move here have kids who are natives, right? So whether you've been here for 60 years or 6 months, there's a place for you in Washington, D.C. to live, work, play, and raise a family. And that's the story that we need to be shouting from the rooftops so that people understand it's just not the seat of the federal government. There's so much more we have to offer in District of Columbia by way of arts and culture and nightlife and sports and hospitality, both as engines of our local economy, but also in a way that makes Washington, D.C. have more of an opportunity economy that we can sell to folks who are interested in coming here. And the best way to attract new people and new businesses is to take care of the ones that are already here. How are we looking after the folks that are here and taking care of our existing small businesses so that they can grow and hire more people in the District of Columbia?
Well, and your opponent doesn't seem to think that, like local businesses outside of the federal government matter much, but I think that's probably a mistake. And like you said, it's all of this really intersects in a way: the economy, crime, the kind of two cities, the transient class versus the locals. You've got to get crime under control because it impacts the poorest communities the most. It's sometimes when you have criminal justice reform conversations, people talk about, well, is it fair to these communities to have strict policing? But these communities are the ones that are suffering from the crime problem. And if the crime problem is solved, then businesses start to open up. You get more job opportunities. You get a virtuous cycle, right? Where, job opportunities mean that people don't have to resort to certain things. And that means that, the locals might decide the transient class might decide to actually settle down because there's good opportunities, even if you leave the government. And, maybe the transient class becomes more local, and, it's all really interconnected.
Yeah, no, it really is. But I will tell you, even when it comes to community safety, I think it's important for people to acknowledge that safety looks different and policing looks different to different communities. And there are certain communities that feel over policed, largely because the police only show up when somebody calls 911 or when there's a crime that occurs. When I was growing up, though, during those tough times in the 80s and 90s, when we were the murder capital of the United States, according to media outlets, I played sports for the Metropolitan Police Boys and Girls Clubs. There was no
Mm.
adversarial relationship between my community and the police. Why? Because they lived and were of our communities. My best friend, who grew up 3 doors down from where I am today, his older brother was a police officer, right? When I walked inside the Boys and Girls Club, which was in a pretty violent community, inside that club was a safe haven, and the first person that greeted me, Jeremiah, was Officer Lynch. And then when I went downstairs to play basketball, one of my coaches was Detective Mitch Creedle, right? And so building those relationships and fostering that trust that I talked about earlier is so essential to policing and to creating opportunity for people to feel safe so that they can leave their communities, go to work, come back home, so that they can connect with young folks in a way that is meaningful. But I'll also say this: the part I talked about with the opportunity means that you have to show up in those communities early and often and expose them to what opportunity looks like. If we're investing billions to build out RFK, a stadium, and then all that commercial development, what does that look like for the young person in middle school right now who's never been exposed to what it's like to be an electrician or to be a carpenter or, to be a plumber, right? It's not to say that they're not going to go to college, but everybody's not built for college. I didn't go to college right away. In fact, I didn't apply to a single college when I graduated in high school, right? So preparing our young folks to be college and career ready. If you want to go off to college, we're going to support you to do that. And if you want to go right into the workforce, what does that look like for the trades or for a workforce that is become increasingly technical? How do they
Hmm.
fit into a community and a workforce that is arts, culture, sports, economy, or one that is, leaning into cyber, that's leaning into AI, that's leaning into climate tech as well. So that's what we need to make sure that we're doing, understanding that that helps to ensure healthy and safe communities too.
Yeah, there's something I feel like it's hard to really grasp unless you've lived and worked around kind of poor communities in certain cities, that you can feel both over policed and under policed at the same time. That, in New York we had stop and frisk, and certainly, people in many communities felt like this was an unfair way to go about things. This was over policing, but they also felt under policed. They also felt the cops weren't there when they
Yeah,
needed to be. And I went out in the mayor's election 4 years ago, and in the poorest communities, they were voting for Eric Adams overwhelmingly because he was a cop.
right.
And it's just it's both, people, they're both the victims of over policing and
That's
under
right.
policing at the same time.
And because they live in communities that have been plagued by violence, and people don't show up except when the violence occurs, after the violence occurs, right? You have to show up for these communities as law enforcement, as first responders generally, during the good times, right? What does it look like for the police officer to simply walk his beat, to grab a cup of coffee at the coffee shop, right? To pick up the basketball and hoop with some of the young folks, right? To organize.
Just to be eyes on the street. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it creates and fosters that trust, right? And it deters crime at the same way, right? Ride your bicycle within the community regularly and say hello to the senior citizen sitting on the porch so that you know her name and she knows yours, right? Those eyes on the street are going to help you both prevent crime, but also to close cases when crimes happen. You cannot think that quality policing is simply showing up to occupy a neighborhood after violence happens. That's not how it works, or nor should it work that way. You've got to take a more comprehensive approach so that you're fostering that trust in a more robust way, so that you're integrating into those communities, so that they see you're invested in them as a trust partner, and as a person who wants to help them be safe 24/7, and not just somebody who shows up after crimes happen. So I think there's a way to do that. And we got to do a better job in DC of incentivizing officers to live in Washington, DC. It's expensive to live here, right? So what does it look like to work with housing providers to double down on our employee housing assistance purchase program, right? I've supported it over the years by sending funding there, but we need to do a better job of really embedding and integrating resources so that our first responders, police, fire, Office of Unified Communications, those types of professions can avail themselves of all the housing that we have, the continuum of housing that we need to have in the District of Columbia, both rental and for sale.
So we're coming up on time. We, like I said, have a lot of listeners nationally and internationally, but probably per capita, the most listeners we have anywhere is Washington, D.C., because there's a lot of there's a lot of people there who are political nerds, just like me, probably just like you, who like to think about policy, who like to think about all this stuff. If there are people in DC listening who want to learn more about you or who want to get involved in the campaign, where can they go? What would you tell them to do if they're interested in learning more about the mayor's race and about your policies and getting in touch?
I would encourage anybody interested in learning about the mayor's race or supporting my campaign for mayor of Washington, D.C., to go online to KenyanMcDuffie.com. Our website has all the resources for you to learn about our platform, to dig into the issues, but you can also sign up if you want to support. You can make a donation online. You can request a yard sign. You can sign up to volunteer to help us canvass, knock on doors, phone bank. There's a myriad of ways that you can get involved in our campaign. And it's going to be important as we think about the fact that we are up against a June 16th primary election, right? 90 days into the primary. And this is about the future of the District of Columbia. This is the most consequential DC mayor's race in our lifetimes. And we want people to get involved because there's a clear difference between myself and the others in this race. I'm not just running using rhetoric or to talk about policies that are going to cost people more and raise people's taxes. I'm talking about growing our local economy with guardrails, a vision of making this city more equitable and more economically inclusive. And I actually have a track record and a long legislative record of the council of doing just that.
All right. Well, one more time, I want to say thank you to our guest, Kenyan McDuffie. Kenyan, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Great talking to you.
Liberal values don't defend themselves. This is a moment when democratic principles in America and around the world are facing some of the darkest times we've seen in nearly a century. And it's more important than ever to build a coalition of young center-left voices to defend liberalism. That's why we're thrilled to announce our 5th annual New Liberal Action Summit, taking place July 15th to 17th in Washington, D.C. We are convening NLAS 2026 to explore fresh new policy ideas that can win elections. We're sharpening our strategy ahead of the 2026 midterms, and we're building a movement that fights for liberalism. Whether you've been in that fight for years or you're just getting started, there's a place for everyone at NLAS. Registration is open right now, and scholarships are available. Come get ready, come learn, meet liberals from around the country and around the world, and help us build a movement that defends liberalism and wins. Go to cnliberalism.org/NLAS to learn more. We would love to see you there.